Perfect. It is loading now, so it will probably say we're live. Yep, it definitely says we're live, even though Facebook is so slow to this. All right, awesome. Hi, everyone. I am Taylor Coumes, and I am the education coordinator here at the Clark County Historical Association. And today we are going to be talking about the Civil War in a conflict zone. We're basically going to be talking about Stephen City and then moving out to Clark County and later in the talk. Today I have Rick and Jonathan Noyalas. Rick is from the Newtown History Center, and Jonathan Noyalas is from the McCormick Institute of Civil War. And we will start off. Do you want to start off, Rick, by talking about Newtown and what they did during the Civil War on the home front?
Sure. So most of the information about home life in Newtown in the Civil War comes from the Steele family, because they started keeping diaries just before the war and recognized that as current events were getting more and more ominous, it might be good to possibly continue through the war. Now, it's definitely not uniform in terms of who's keeping a diary and what they're necessarily putting into them. But from there, we see that the town constantly has troop movements going through. So if the Union controls Winchester and they want to send troops to foray to the south, they go through Newtown because it's only just 10 miles down the road and the main highway happens to pass through both towns. On the other hand, if there are Confederates controlling the valley, then you would have them going through the town to head to Winchester, because both armies tended to make that city their base of operations in the valley. At the same time, there's a lot of normal life continuing on. Some of the diary entries I think are particularly interesting are from 1861, when the war is just barely started, and it still feels very much like a distant thing. You see life as normal going on almost entirely. If you think back to what things were like in February and early March with coronavirus, I think you can see a similar parallel where we know this thing is going on, but it's over there. And then once the war arrives in the valley, you see something like what we're dealing with today, where it's part and parcel, but they're also continuing with normal events. So a typical diary entry in 1863 or 1864 might say, this unit of soldiers went through today, I spoke to a friend, and I churned 8 pounds of butter.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, once the Civil War happened, it seemed like a lot of people were either joined the fight, obviously, stayed at home, or had to open their doors. What do you think about that, Jonathan?
Yeah, so well, just a couple of things. So, for one, I think when people look at the Civil War in the Shenandoah Valley, oftentimes they refer to communities like Winchester or Stephen City or Berryville, and they talk about, the war on the home front. And I don't know in the sense of the Valley that it's fair to say home front, because I think, as Rick pointed out, just looking at the Steele diaries and how there's this incessant activity, I really think the Valley's civilians, and we're talking, about a wide demographic. You have, some people who are pro-union. So you have about 10 to 15% of the Valley's population have always had sympathies resting with the Union. You have the Valley's enslaved, which comprise about 21% of the total population of the Valley at the war's outset. You have free blacks. And then, of course, you have a significant chunk of the population do indeed support the Confederate war effort. So, people react to the war in the lower Shenandoah Valley, I think, in very different ways. So you have some people who are, very active and aggressive supporters. So, I think of Mary Greenhow Lee in Winchester, always thinking about ways that she could, try to undermine federal occupation. Then you have individuals like the Pritchard family in Kernstown, which sit, right smack dab in the middle of land that's owned by the Kernstown Battlefield Association. And I think for a lot of the war, I would classify Mr. Pritchard as kind of a leave-aloner. So I'm certain some of our viewers have seen the movie with Jimmy Stewart back in the mid-1960s came out, Shenandoah. And I think Mr. Pritchard is a lot like that. I'm not going to really do anything until the war is on my doorstep, and eventually it comes there. So it kind of runs the gamut in how people react to this thing. Some are aggressive, some want to kind of keep back a little bit. I think certainly you find that with unionist sympathizers, because they don't want to give up their loyalty, but also they want to come out in a community where 90% of the population are pro-Confederate and say, hey, I'm all for the Union. You can come and get me now. And then, of course, for African Americans, it's a very difficult world for them to navigate. Do you flee? Do you run away? Do you stay put? If you do flee, how are you going to survive? All these types of different things. So, I think it's important for people when they look at the war in the Shenandoah Valley, and I think in particular where we're at in the Lower Valley, they're not experiencing the war from a home front perspective. To me, home front is a place that is not touched by the war, other than you have men marching off. You might be a rear echelon where wounded are coming in, or you have people impacted by a son, a brother, husband. I mean, in the Lower Valley in particular, they're experiencing the war on an incessant basis. I often think back to this study that was done by the National Park Service years ago, and they tabulated how many different military actions there were in the Valley. There's 326 different actions during 4 years of conflict. So that's like once every 4 days, somewhere in the Valley, something is going on. And the bulk of those are happening where we're at in the lower part of the Shenandoah Valley. So there are these very tense moments. And I think certainly, if you look at a community like Stephen City, which is it's a little bit different, not, geographically too far removed from Winchester, but, Winchester was always firmly in the hands of one army or the other, Union or Confederate. But Stephen City kind of falls into this no man's land border region, that neither side really is controlling at any given point. But I mean, when I think of Stephen City, there are two stories that come to mind, and I'm going to expand on these if I have a chance. So, one of I think the tensest moments for any person living in Stephen City, Newtown, during the war was, late May into early June of 1864. It's by this point in the war, Union General Franz Sigel, and then later General David Hunter, who takes over for Sigel after Sigel's defeat at the Battle of Newmarket, is really trying to pinpoint what is the thing that is creating all of this instability in the Valley. What is it that's creating the greatest threat to our armies? And it's guerrilla warfare, it's partisan warfare, it's bushwhackers, and those types of things. And there is this litany of events that happen, beginning on May 23rd, 1864, where you have bushwhackers attack a Union wagon train in Stephen City that just goes from one event to blowing up to where, the day after, David Hunter orders Timothy Quinn and the 1st New York Cavalry to come in and burn 3 structures. One of those structures was the home of Dolph White, who was a well-known slave trader from Frederick County, Virginia. The other was the Harmon family home, because they were believed to have harbored a number of bushwhackers. And then the third structure was to be determined. And basically Hunter said, whatever house is closest to where the attack occurred, that's the house that would be burned. And it turns out when Quinn's New Yorkers came into Stephen City on the 24th, they saw an abandoned federal wagon sitting right in front of the Reverend Wall's home on the northern side of Stephen City. And so the Wall's home was destroyed as a result. And what comes out in the Steele family diaries is that there was actually an African-American man from Stephen City named Ed Banks, who saw the wagon parked on the Valley Pike in front of Locust Hill, which is, we have some viewers out there, honestly, probably know Butch Fravel. That's his house. And that wagon is parked out there. Ed Banks says, hey, this is pretty cool. I'm going to take the wagon. And he manhandles it, gets exhausted by the time he gets to the Wall's home, abandons it. And so the Wall's home is destroyed as a result. But you go through these kind of tense moments in late May, early June, where it gets to the point where David Hunter gave an order to burn the entire community to the ground. And ultimately, Joseph Stearns doesn't carry out that directive, and instead, encourages people to take an oath of allegiance to the federal government. And so, Newtown is saved as a result. So, I mean, I couldn't imagine living in that kind of environment where you have all of this tension playing out in that last week of May and the early part of June, where you think your entire community could be leveled because of the actions of a handful of people. But the other thing that I want to mention quickly before we move on is the story of Lee Jenkins. So Lee Jenkins was a free black man from Stephen City. And during Robert Milroy's occupation of Winchester during the first 6 months of 1863, Lee Jenkins worked as part of Milroy's intelligence gathering network. So he was gathering information, he was doing all sorts of espionage activity. And on the morning of June the 15th, 1863, Lee Jenkins, along with hundreds, if not thousands, of African Americans, were fleeing north with Milroy's army as Confederate General Richard Ewell's Corps was driving them from Winchester. And some of them made it safely into Pennsylvania. And then there were several hundred like Lee Jenkins who were captured by Confederate soldiers and impressed into the Confederacy service. And, this to me is a very powerful moment. This is a great example of how you can talk about a battle, which is, at the core of what the Civil War is, because it is a war after all, but how you can talk about a battle and how it impacts certain demographics of a civilian population. Lee Jenkins was impressed about a week or so after, well, less than a week after the battle. He's being marched through Stephen City South to be impressed, presumably to work on the construction of fortifications around Richmond. And he's thinking in his mind, I have never been enslaved, but I know what it's like because I've seen slavery. And he decides to break ranks and kill himself. He jumps into a well on the property of Thornton McLeod. And of course, the Steele family diary is where this account largely comes from. So these are some very dramatic moments, and just a real snapshot of some of these dramatic moments here.
Yeah. Do you have anything to comment on that, Brick?
Yeah, so there's some additional information that comes out with those that, again, I can see some modern parallels, but also, I guess, just things that are unique to the past. At first, with that series of raids and the near burning in 1864, as Jonathan mentioned, bushwhackers and partisans, those are two different terms for two different types of people. So a bushwhacker is somebody who's not officially in the military. They just really care about one side or another, so they grab their gun, go out the front door, and try to create chaos for whatever side they don't like. Now, the bushwhackers who did that first raid in late May actually were from Maryland. And what's really striking to me is that in the Steele family diaries, they refer to these guys as horse thieves. The Steeles have two sons in the Confederate Army. So it's not exactly like this is some kind of pro-union bias denigrating on these bushwhackers. My impression is they were genuinely just not very nice people. They stayed between the two armies and presumably, I suppose, stole horses, but did so more in a way that benefited the Confederates than the Union. And you see that a lot with modern day warfare, especially with the most recent conflicts that our country's been in, that we have insurgents. So we tend to think of them as a lot of locals who are coming out to just fight against the U.S. soldiers whom they don't like having around in their country. In many cases, these are actually people who are not officially joining any kind of military, and they're coming from all over the world to fight us in Iraq or Afghanistan. I see a parallel there. It doesn't mean it's the exact same thing, but a similar idea of you're not officially in the military, but you're still fighting. And in both cases, it looks like the military struggles with how do you react to something like that. A partisan ranger is an official Confederate soldier who has a rank, who has orders, and works under a chain of command, but they aren't marching out into major battles with Lee or Longstreet or Early or anyone else. They're operating in either this sort of gray zone like Newtown is, what John McGill still referred to as between the lines, or they're operating outright behind enemy lines. Mosby is the most famous example of this, and he actually produced the third raid in that week when the burnings nearly happened. Harry Gilmore from Baltimore is another example. And once again, as somebody from Baltimore, he came from a Union state, but he officially enlisted in the Confederate Army to operate behind enemy lines. With Lee Jenkins, we see a little bit of a premonition that he's nervous, because at one point in the diaries, it mentions that he came to town to get all of his furniture and belongings out, and he came with the Union escort. So it's clear the Steeles don't know everything that's going on in his case, but they can tell something's made Lee very uneasy.
Yeah, those are great examples, and for showing everything that's on the, like Jonathan said, it's not really a home front. But do you guys have, I'm curious, any other type of, besides the Steele diaries, any type of diaries that show that conflict and tension in Newtown from a home perspective?
Yeah, I think there's a published diary. It's called the Memoirs of Two Rebel Sisters. There's a lot from the Walls family in there. It was published, I want to say late 1990s. I have a copy on my bookshelf right over here. But it's a great diary that goes into various discussions of things, not just what we've talked about, but some other things as well. One of the things Mary Walls writes about in her diary is about the reaction to emancipation. And in there, she writes something to the effect of, and I'm quoting here, or trying to do my best to remember a quote, so excuse me if I'm wrong, but she said, it's surprisingly well to see how well the African Americans in Stephen City behaved even after emancipation. And what she means by behave is, there's no riotous behavior, there's no insurrection and those types of things. And, this is one of these things as a historian, it's really important to dissect and understand, why that's the case. For one, Robert Milroy, when he comes to Winchester on New Year's Day, 1863, he is coming there with the intent to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation. And Taylor, you've had class with me during your days as an undergrad at SU, so you've heard me talk at length about Milroy and how he basically believed that the Union Army would not achieve any sort of victory until the institution of slavery was eradicated, because he saw slavery as a great weapon in the Confederate war effort. And so, Milroy, I think, is part of the reason that you don't have insurrection, because he issued on January the 5th a document, Freedom to Slaves, which was plastered all over Frederick County. And it was really basically a bullet point of how he was going to enforce emancipation. And one of the things that Milroy put in there is he requested that all African Americans, quote unquote, betake themselves to useful occupations. So you have individuals like Lee Jenkins, a free Black man going to Winchester, working in Milroy's intelligence gathering network, as scores of others had done. And so, that's one of the reasons. But also, when you think about this, and I'm thinking about this sort of what I think is a great meditation on African-American reaction to emancipation. It's from a great book published recently by Aaron Sheehan Dean, and it's entitled The Calculus of Violence. And in order to have a successful, sustained insurrection, you need resources. Like, stuff doesn't happen overnight. It takes months, if not years, to achieve. And so, the fact that you're not organized, don't have the logistical support to carry out all these types of things. This is why, African Americans behaved in the manner that they did, because they felt, again, looking at what Aaron Sheehan Dean writes in there, that it was sort of counterproductive to do this, because the ultimate goal is freedom and survival, and what ultimately at the end of the day is going to be achieved if we just have, violent behavior for a couple days or a couple weeks, what's going to be achieved as a result. So yeah, I mean, I would say hers, the Walls Diary is great. But beyond that, I don't know, Rick, there's not a lot of published diaries available.
Not that I'm aware of. And Between the Lines is technically unpublished.
Right.
But Butch Rabel, who compiled it, has done a great job of getting the Walls accounts and other accounts compiled with it to correspond.
Mm-hmm.
So especially with something like the near burning we have orders from the Union Army, we have accounts from Union soldiers, and we have accounts from some of the townspeople, all to fill out what's in there. We don't have it published yet.
Yeah, and there are, back in the, and I know the Winchester Frederick County Historical Society has excerpts from the Steele Diary published in their broader recollections of the war, which I think is still in print. So there's some aspects of it in there as well.
Well, one thing that we're doing now, because of the parallels we've seen in the coronavirus pandemic, is every day that we're in work, we're taking that day's entries in the Steele Diaries and we're putting them up on our Facebook page. So if you like to follow us on Facebook, you'll be able to see a pretty good portion. We started on April 1st. So at this point, we have about 2 months worth of the diaries up there. Although one thing I did notice is that the only diarist reporting in 1865 is Milton Voigt Steele. He was the most faithful diarist. He goes back to 1861 when he was 15 or 16. By 1865, he's an adult and he's serving in the Confederate Army outside Richmond. So it was very interesting to see his accounts of the war ending from a sort of firsthand perspective, and him going off of the intelligence that's coming in, which sometimes is accurate, sometimes it's not. But also, right after Appomattox, that just ends. And for reasons I don't know of, his mother back home, who wrote very constantly in 1864, or his older sister, who was often writing in 1862 and 3, don't say anything.
Yeah, we have quite a few diaries from the Civil War era. Most of them are soldiers, Union, Confederate soldiers. We don't have a lot of at the home front type of diaries of, women and children. We have a few, but not as big of a collection as like we would like to have, especially with you hear about women on the home front, that it wasn't just they just didn't stay at home and cook and clean while everything was happening during the Civil War. There was a lot, they had a lot more duties to do than a normal housewife, a normal housewife would do. But it seems that it's just, we have noticed even with, the pandemic happening and everything happening now with, Black Lives Matter. I mean, it's super important that all of this is documented. And it feels like that we don't have enough documents. We have quite a few, but it seems like we don't have enough. We more and more. And that's, I guess, it's a problem with every institution. You're wanting more and more. You'll find a story. You'll find a great story about something that happened that was amazing. And then you get to the end of the story and something wasn't resolved, but you can't find the missing piece. So it's kind of interesting to see how every institution is taking that, going from the Civil War to modern day and seeing how we can fix that with modern day technology, oral histories, doing these Zoom chats. I mean, it's interesting to see how conflict has evolved in a different way too. Conflict is still the same. Conflict is conflict. But it has turned into a different source now.
Yeah, and I would add to that, just in terms of sources, and again, not Newtown specific, but Mary Greenhow Lee was very intimately connected, and I think there are significant things that you can glean from her diary about life in Newtown during the war. So even if it's not within that community itself, people are well aware. I mean, Winchester has a great abundance of diaries from, Julia Chase and Laura Lee and Mary Lee and, Kate Sperry and all these other individuals. And, a close reading of those, you'll be able to pull out some really important, relevant information. But, to me, what courses throughout all of these things is the uncertain nature of life. So, I mean, we can look at a diary, we can know, well, between, January 10th and March the 13th, well, nothing really happened. But for people living at that moment, that time, I mean, think about the coronavirus pandemic. Every day at 5 o'clock, I look at West Virginia's, because I live in Martinsburg, I look at our corona report to see where we're at. And, are the numbers going down? Are they going up? Are they staying steady? So, you can look back in retrospect and say, well, nothing happened. They had nothing to be worried about. But, we're not living at that time. That perspective of uncertainty, causes a lot of anxiety and fear. And you see that reflected in diaries all over the place.
Yeah, you kind of it kind of makes you think, what were civilians, what were they thinking about? They knew people were dying. They had to have known. But they were ignorant to how many. They knew people were dying, but it was like, okay, things are happening, people are fighting. This is our cause. This is what we're doing, whether you're a Confederate on the Confederate side or the Union side. But it wasn't like media we have now where it's, oh, here's how many people died this way. Like you said, looking at the status. I mean, I've been looking at Winchester, every day, checking Virginia. How have we been going up, going down with the coronavirus? And it's interesting to see, like, they had no means of knowing that. And they got a letter home or a soldier on their doorsteps telling them, sorry, like, maybe they were lost in battle. Maybe they weren't. Maybe a deserter. We don't know where they are. They could be dead. It's very uncertain.
Well, and that's what makes, but I think that's what makes the study of the Shenandoah Valley rather unique, is because in a place like Winchester, I think maybe on a more traditional home front, there isn't that lack of awareness. But certainly by the time you get into, the spring campaign of ~62 to the end of the war, civilians are seeing the consequence of this. You think about the massive amounts of hospitals that are established throughout the area, and the civilians. So, they might not know what's happening to their relative who is in Savannah or wherever the case might be, but they certainly have a front row seat to the massive tragedy and destruction of war. And that's really, one of the things, and this kind of goes back, Taylor, to what we talked about. I don't know if it was weeks or months ago. Days run together anymore. Every day is Saturday. Pandemic. But, about why it is so important to study this period. And there are a lot of reasons. I mean, we still deal with the legacies, obviously, of the conflict today. But I mean, thinking about our discussions that we had about Cool Spring, I mean, studying a battle, studying a campaign, studying it on the level of the individual and the soldier, you really get a sense of how it impacts people on an individual basis, whether it's not just the soldier, but the wife and the daughter and the mother, and the long-term impacts of all of this. And it's a tragic reminder, as I've said, of what happens when people become divided to an unbridgeable point.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, a couple of things. First, we as historians do tend to primarily focus on documents, but there are always other sources, material sources that can be left behind. And we definitely see it with the Civil War. We see it with archaeological findings from battlefields and campsites and skirmish sites. We see it with remnants on buildings, where there could be buildings with some graffiti put in, or at Locust Hill, that home that Jonathan mentioned earlier, where the wagon was in front of it. There's actually a cubbyhole that's been cut away, from my understanding, where Confederate soldiers could hide in case any Union soldiers happened to swing by. There's also some artifacts that have been picked up. So we have a Union saddle that came into possession of the Steele family. And we're not entirely sure how it came about, but one of the stories we have in there is of John Steele, who was about 11 years old when this happened, just out in the field one day, and he runs across a couple of Union soldiers, and they get talking to him. They ask if he has any older brothers. He says yes. Is this brother in the army for the Confederates? He says yes. They say, well, how do you like a saddle? You want a saddle? And according to him, he's just standing there all awkwardly, not sure if this is a joke or not, but apparently these guys are serious. And they gave one of their saddles to this young boy, knowing that he had older brothers serving on the other side of the conflict. I think that dovetails, too, into another aspect of the war, especially when the war is in your community and home front isn't simply, this safe place back home where nobody is at risk, but when it's right in the middle of the conflict zone. You get to know the individuals. So the reason why some of those bushwhackers could be called horse thieves is because they spent enough time around Newtown that word got out about what those guys were like. The Steele family ended up actually making some friends with the Union soldiers, even though they're pro-Confederate, because they made their ends meet by choosing to bake pies and churn butter and such, and then sell these to the Union soldiers. They're doing these very domestic chores as an economic means of sustaining themselves rather than trying to continue with life as usual. In the process, they make some good relationships with some of the Union soldiers. There's probably some who they came to absolutely disrespect too. And part of it depends on the personality of the individual. I get the impression that Inez Virginia Steele was probably the most pro-Confederate member of the family and the most anti-Union. But her attitudes won't necessarily carry over to all the other members. And make no mistake, at the end of the day, even if they're willing to make friends with some of the Union soldiers, they're still pro-Confederate. The Union might march through during the day, and the family might become the source of intelligence at night. If any Confederates swing by at night to maybe get a meal or to get some rest, a family might tell them who's gone through the area. Even if it's not the Steeles, we know there are other families in Newtown boarding people. We know that if a Confederate military unit happened to be in the area where some of the men are from, they're likely to go home at night and then ask, your mom or your wife, who's been going through? Well, the 13th Pennsylvania, the 1st New York, and then you can report that back to your commander.
And that's a really important point that you made about interactions that civilians have with soldiers. And, I'm going to go a little bit further south in the valley to Dayton, Virginia, and, think about what happened in the first week of October, 1864, following the death of Lieutenant James Rogers Meigs. And General Sheridan, when he learned about this, his initial impulse was it was murder. It wasn't an act of war, and he ordered that Dayton be burned to the ground and everything within a 5-mile radius be destroyed. And the officer who was supposed to carry out the destruction of Dayton, and there's a parallel here between early June of '64 when Joseph Stearns is in Newtown and Dayton in early October. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Wilds of 116th Ohio could not bring himself to burn Dayton to the ground because his Buckeyes had established a relationship with the civilians there. And yes, they were of, pro-Confederate leanings, but as they look at these people in the eye, women and children, how do we torch their homes? And so he didn't do it. And remarkably, there was, during the Civil War Centennial, there was a monument dedicated to Wild's memory in Dayton. It's still there, discussing how he refused Sheridan's order. And Sheridan initially, of course, blew up and, said, I can't believe this. This is egregious. And ultimately, he backed off because he respected Wilds as an officer. But yeah, it's not just as simple as, carry out the order because, again, this is an area where there's armies for extended periods of time and they establish relationships with one another. And when you're given that order to burn a home or a barn or whatever to the ground, you're torn because you understand what the military order is, but also you have gotten things from these people and they've helped you or talked to you and supported you in some way. So it's a very complex dynamic. And, people like to look at history as very cut and dry. And as all of us know, it's very complex. It's very nuanced. There's not a, one size fits all answer to anything when it comes to the study of the past.
And that brings up something I've thought about a lot when I've studied this coming in from Pennsylvania for my job. And I think you'd be a good person to answer for me, Jonathan. I'm not sure if some of the more vindictive measures taken by Union commanders are really effective on a military level. I mean, insurgencies are in some ways always harder to stamp out than conventional armies because it's so much harder to define what a victory is. But when Hunter in particular, but also Sheridan took vindictive measures of burning personal property that had no military value, I think that contributed a lot more to a historical memory for the 150 years since the war, where I suspect actually there may have been less Union sympathy in the Valley after the war was over than there was during the war itself because of some of those measures.
Oh, yeah. I think you're 100% correct. There was a great multi-volume publication put out by the Brethren Mennonite Heritage Center in Rockingham County, Unionists in the Shenandoah Valley. And basically, and if anyone hasn't read through this, I'd recommend, I believe you can still purchase these through their website or through Amazon and used bookstores. But it basically takes Southern Claims Commission reports from Rockingham County specifically. And it's interesting to look through, the amount of individuals in those claims who had pro-union leanings. There are actually African-Americans in there who had property taken or destroyed by federal soldiers during that very destructive period of the burning. So it's not just, people don't hang signs outside their house that said, I support the Confederacy, I support the Union, I'm indifferent. If soldiers are ordered to carry out an order, take the hay or the pigs or whatever the case is, they're not going to ask to show your papers and see what your allegiance is. They're just going to go out and do it. So yeah, that would be a really interesting study to look at how all of those types of activities and destruction really impact people. Because if you do have people who are living in an area that isn't as heavily touched by war like you have in Newtown or Winchester, and they've largely been able to kind of get through unscathed, and all of a sudden federal soldiers show up and without any explanation whatever, they take your stuff, and what they don't take, they burn and destroy. I think that would have the impact of causing people to lean over towards the opposition. So yeah, I'm not certain how, on the personal level, how effective that ultimately would be. I think it would have the opposite effect.
Yeah. What you mentioned about not checking if somebody's Union or Confederate in their sympathies reminds me of what you mentioned earlier with Lee Jenkins. When I hear that story, it makes sense that the Confederacy would have impressed him into service and effectively enslaved him, even though he was a free man, because they're not going to take the time to check your status. They're not going to take the time to do an investigation and see who was enslaved and ran off to Winchester to become free and who was already free in the first place. And of course, what would somebody say in that situation? And nobody's going to volunteer, be like, oh yeah, I used to be enslaved, but I ran off, so I guess I'm back to going into slavery again. So then they're just going to round up everyone indiscriminately and assume you're one way or the other.
Right.
So we do have a couple questions. One and this is just a general question for you and Rick, was your town or county divided in allegiance, or were they all Confederates? Whoever wants to go first.
So
About Stephen City in specific?
I'll answer for Stephen City.
And for Stephen City, Winchester, Clark, we can talk about each of them if you want, however you want to do it.
Okay, so I don't know a lot of the details about who was who necessarily, because I'm still relatively new to the job and getting to know some of these families from the past. But Stephen City was divided. My understanding is because of the near burning in 1864, they did become more pro-Confederate with time. But even with some of the accounts I have of the town's response to the near burning, and when they have delegations going to the 1st New York Cavalry, who was supposed to carry out this order, to make reference to the fact that there are pro-Union people in town, to say, hey, we're not all pro-Confederate, and even those of us who are have taken care of Union sick, etc. You see degrees and radiance of it. So Eliza Kern Steele, the mother of the family, is pro-Confederate, but there's an account where it's very clear she's very sad about the whole thing. She's talking to a Union soldier, and you can tell she's reluctantly picking sides, I guess because she feels like she has to. Whereas her daughter, Inez, at one point mentioned Yankee dogs. I'm sure Inez felt less conflicted. And let's also not forget to take into account that these towns included both white people and African-American people. And while what to do during the war is still a very difficult, complicated subject for the African-Americans who lived here, the side that they ultimately supported was more cut and dry for them. If the Confederacy wins, slavery continues. Whatever else might be going on, that is a factor for them. For the white people in town, there's more to consider than that. Whether they're for or against slavery is going to be a factor in that consideration, but they also are property owners. They also have certain conceptions of their rights. They might have ideas about what either side's going to do for their well-being in other ways, like the economy. So no matter what, it's a complicated, difficult decision for people, but we do see people coming down on one side or another to varying degrees of enthusiasm.
Yeah, and to add to that, so I'll kind of expand out and speak more broadly to that within the Shenandoah Valley. I think it's a very difficult thing to say one community is this or the other. Again, scholarship that studies this, not only in the Valley, but across the South, it's not unusual to have 10 to 15% of any community that has pro-unionist leanings. And it's very easy in a place like Winchester, for example, or Frederick County, to know who some of the unionists are. So back in 2006, I published a biography about General Robert Milroy. And, Milroy is one of these guys who is a very polarizing figure locally. If you were a Confederate, you hated him. If you were pro-Union or African-American, you loved him because he gave you security. But there are petitions. After the Second Battle of Winchester, Robert Milroy was arrested by Chief of Staff General Henry Halleck because he said that Milroy disobeyed his orders to not pull back from Winchester. And so there were actually civilians from Winchester and Frederick County Unionists who petitioned President Lincoln to have Milroy restored to command. There is a petition I still believe it's there at the Hanley Archives. There is a petition that I found from the Library of Virginia So it has, these are like the one petition I used in my biography, there are 67 male unionist names attached to this. So there's real hard concrete evidence. But as Rick rightly points out, there are gradations to how unionists in particular are going to show their devotion to the union cause. Not really going to be all that, because you're still in a significant minority of the population. You're not going to be going out there saying, I'm a unionist. But you do have unionists, white unionists like Rebecca Wright, who, you know, serves as a spy in essence for General Philip Sheridan in mid-September 1864, providing him with very valuable information that leads to his launching of the 1864 Shenandoah campaign. And, you know, right after the Third Battle of Winchester was over, was visited by Sheridan, and Sheridan asked her, is there anything that I can do to repay you? And she said, yes, don't tell anyone about this, because she understood that her life would be threatened if people found out. And ultimately it did leak. In the early part of 1867, she was driven out of Winchester, and Rebecca Wright has this, and I think this encounter that she has in 1867 really typifies things for unionists. There was a male unionist, so this is 2 years almost after the war is over, in Virginia, who grabs Rebecca Wright's hand and basically says, I'm really glad you did what you did, but I wouldn't have had the courage to do it myself. And then the other part of the equation, as Rick intimated, is how do African Americans react? So there are about 700 African Americans with ties to the Valley who, at various points in the war, enlist and serve in United States colored troop regiments. And, you know, there are some buried, for example, in Oryx Cemetery. There are 2 buried there, Edward Hall and Richard Festus. There are 12 USCT veterans buried in the National Cemetery in Winchester, 3 in marked graves, 9 in unmarked graves. So it's not really a fair thing to say, well, Winchester is all this or all that, or Stephen City is all this or all that. It really is a mix. It is an individual decision. There are accounts of unionists from the Rockingham County area after Confederate conscription went into effect in April of 1862. Don't want to be drafted into the Confederate service. And so there is a unionist underground railroad created in Rockingham County to spirit these men of military age out. So, you know, the more that you drill down into Valley history and Civil War history in general, it is very, very complicated. And you can't just paint things with a broad brush. It's one or the other. These deep divisions existed within communities and sometimes even within households. I'm reminded right now as I discuss this, Cornelia MacDonald, who becomes one of the so-called devil diarists of Winchester, really flamboyant Confederate. During the secession crisis, she had numerous arguments with her husband about whether or not the act of secession would lead to war. And women across the South were very, very wary of this because they're thinking, okay, if secession leads to war, well, then this could mean my husband or my son or my brother is going to be killed. So it's very, very complex.
Yeah, I mean, you see it in Clark too. I mean, we had our own Black community, you know, still we had multiple different Black communities. And it wasn't, I would never say that it was split down the middle, but there were definitely some Unionists and Confederates. It's just like today, like you have the Democratic Party and you have Conservative Party. There's certain regions that have more than the other, but you're never going to have a whole slew of people that are just like, okay, this city has all Confederates, they're all conservatives, they're all Democrats. And it's just, that's all they are. When everybody is an individual person has individual ideas or opinions. But we have another question. Were there Quakers in the Winchester, Stephen City area? And if so, Do you know anything about their stance during the Civil War?
Well, Rebecca Wright was a Quaker. And I think the Wright family is a great example of how it's kind of a microcosm of how Quakers responded. Rebecca Wright was obviously a Unionist sympathizer. Her mother, Rachel, was Unionist. Her sister, Hannah, supported the Confederacy. I've come across, there are Quakers from Frederick County. I actually have a student, I won't mention her name. Don't know if she's on here. If she wants to say something, she can. But her ancestors were Quaker and supported the Confederate war effort. So again, even within the realms of religious denominations, you still have examples of people making individual decisions. I'm either going to go Union, Confederate, or try to remain neutral throughout the conflict.
Have you seen any, Rick, in your community, or have read about any in your community?
So my understanding of Newtown and Quakerism is that you're mostly see Quakers in our area in the prior century. That they were never much of a large population here, but over time, they tend to move more out into the western hinterlands of Frederick County. Areas along Cedar Creek Grade or Apple Pie Ridge, those still very rural areas to the west of our towns along 11. And because of that, we don't study them too much at the Newtown History Center. There's a lot of other museums in this area that cover other aspects of Frederick County history. So to avoid stepping on everyone's toes, we each have our own little places that we specialize in. And for Newtown History Center, it's Stephen City and some of the immediate environs.
Yeah, and I'd recommend to people who are watching today, again, if you want to kind of read more about this, not just Quakers, but other religious denominations and how they reacted to what was going on in the Civil War era. A good friend of mine teaches at Bridgewater College, Dr. Stephen Longenecker, published a book. It's called Religious Outsiders in the Mainstream. And it's a really fascinating study about how those different religious denominations, whether it's Quakers, Brethren, Mennonite, whatever the case is, kind of reacted, coped with, and dealt with a lot of these things that we're talking about today.
There's another one written by Mark Knoll. Tends to take a broader picture, I suppose, but it's called The Civil War as a Theological Crisis. Mm-hmm. And there it's literally looking at what did different Christian groups believe leading up to the war and how that influenced the way that they see the war and all the matters surrounding it. Where essentially the Civil War does lead to a crisis of belief for many of these denominations, that if certain lines of belief make sense beforehand, well, suddenly this crisis is calling that into question. It's one thing to believe something in a vacuum or in a safe zone where everything can be a little more theoretical, but then when you're starting to see events play out on the ground, that can challenge your beliefs if what should be happening according to how you understand things isn't playing out. Well, then what do you make of that?
Yeah. So we do have one last question. And then you guys can talk about anything that your organizations are doing and put that out for our audience. But our last question is, families in the South suffered more simply because the vast majority of conflicts occurred here. Is that why Southerners still maintain a more vivid recollection of the war?
That's a good question. So let me answer it in this regard. One of my more recent books is called Civil War Legacy in the Shenandoah, Remembrance, Reunion, and Reconciliation. And one of the artifacts I came across, so this is, Rick's earlier point, there's more than just documents that historians look at to understand something. Mm-hmm. And this artifact came to my attention through a really good friend, a great historian in her own right, Nancy Sarles, does a lot with Augusta County history. And it was a bottle of burnt wheat. And there's a photograph of this in my book, Civil War Legacy in the Shenandoah. And on the label, it reads, burnt wheat taken from the Klein Mill, Augusta County, autumn 1864. And this bottle has been passed down in, the family from one generation to the next as a reminder of all of the turmoil and destruction and tragedy that was endured here. And so, look, I think there is no denying there's a lot of scholarship done about memory of the war. I think about the book Still Fighting the American Civil War, published by LSU Press a number of years ago. There's no denying that on so many levels, the Civil War leaves very deep scars on a wide range of individuals. And, depending on how you're connected to that conflict, it's very difficult to forgive and move on. I don't know the individuals that were passing this bottle down from one generation to the next, but to me, you're passing that artifact of burnt wheat in a glass bottle as a reminder of what happened to our family property in the autumn of 1864. And so, one of the points that Still Fighting the Civil War takes into account is that, artifacts like this and stories like this are almost passed down as holy relics. And so it's not just part of a national story, it's a very personal story. And, we all have our own family backgrounds and family stories. And, my family wasn't even here at the time of the Civil War. They immigrated from Lithuania, Poland, and the Ukraine in the early 1900s. And so, I don't have that connection in any aspect, but certainly, yeah, I think that really does account for it. And I remember being struck when I saw that artifact about how, this is passed down as a reminder of all the tumultuous toil that people had to endure and deal with.
Definitely. Anything to add, Rick?
It's not an area I know as well as Jonathan does. I think another element might be what happens after the war ends. Because, we know that history is never exactly like a movie. It's not like Appomattox happens and then this whole thing is just over. There's reactions both in the North and the South to the war's end, to Lincoln's assassination. One thing that stands out to me is Appalachia was often more pro-Union than Confederate during the war. That's why West Virginia seceded from Virginia to join the Union. East Tennessee tried to do the same thing with the state of Franklin, but ultimately failed to. But in Reconstruction, if I understand right, so I'm happy to be corrected on this here live for everyone to see, the attitude among some of the Northerners was, we need to change the entire Southern culture, which was wrong, not only in that the South was not a monolith, where you had Appalachia being different from some of the other regions, but also in terms of looking at some of the attitudes involved in maybe if that was the right thing to do or not in the first place. As Victor should just say, okay, we need to completely change how losers see things. So I think now, if you see more pro-Confederate rhetoric coming out from Appalachia after the war, it's because of what happened after the war to them. West Virginia sides with the Union, and then what do they get for it?
Awesome. Well, thank you to everyone that asked questions. Is there anything going on at Newtown that we need to know about that's happening soon or that is currently happening that the audience would like to know?
Well, we open to the public on Wednesday. We'll be open from 10 to 4, and that'll start a normal season. So from now, essentially through September, it'll be Tuesdays through Saturdays from 10 to 4, and then Sundays from 1 to 5. And admission will be $2. We'll have some protocol in place for coronavirus. We ask that you wear a mask if you're inside, unless you're under the age of 10 or you have a breathing problem. We ask that the individuals in your party stay 6 feet apart from somebody who's not in your party. And that's essentially the gist of it for us. I mean, 50 people is, I think, more than we can handle, so the occupancy limit.
Oh, yeah, definitely. We said the same thing with people coming to our museum. We never have a big group like 50 people. To the mill, yes. When we have people come to the mill, we definitely have a bigger group. But the museum, we don't have that kind of group. So we said, we were like, that's not going to be a big issue for us. Jonathan, what's going on? I know there's a couple of things happening for you guys.
We've got some stuff on the docket. So when the pandemic hit, we're thinking about different types of programming to do. So we advertised starting June the 15th. So June the 15th, June the 18th, June the 23rd, and then June the 25th, if I'm doing math right in my head really quickly. We're going to have a 4-part webinar, Topics in Shenandoah Valley Civil War History. Again, this is not exhaustive, not going to cover everything about the Shenandoah Valley. It's very focused. So on the 15th, we're looking at the impact of Jackson's Valley campaign on the civilian populations in the Valley. So again, this covers, some people hear Jackson's Valley campaign and think, oh, he's just going to talk about the battles. No, we are going to talk about the impact of the battles in the campaign on civilian populations. And as I've said, civilian populations are very diverse. So it's going to be how it impacted Confederate civilians and Unionist civilians and African Americans and the gamut. That's our first session. Our second session is going to look at Robert Milroy and his defeat at the Second Battle of Winchester. So Milroy, again, as I said, enforcer of the Emancipation Proclamation, looking at his arrest, what it meant to the Gettysburg campaign. Then on the following week, this 22nd of June, we will look at the Third Battle of Winchester, particularly the cavalry at Third Winchester, and really their fight for memory. So it discusses some of the battle, but also how there was this battle for memory decades after the conflict, and how that played out in art and poetry. And then the last session is going to focus on the legacy and meaning of Fisher's Hill. Again, not a lecture about the battle per se, as some people might think, but rather looking at what this place meant. How did Union and Confederate veterans, what did they do when they came back here after the war? How did this in any way kind of advance healing? So that's one set of things we're doing. And that's a free webinar. So if you want to sign up, only thing you have to do is email me. It's jnoyalas01@su.edu. You need to register by Wednesday, June the 10th. So this Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern time. And we've already had, well over 200 people sign up for this webinar across the country. Then we're going to have some other events in the week leading up to our Cool Spring anniversary. So the pandemic, we aren't going to have anything on site in person, but we are going to do a series of videos looking at different aspects of the battle and how it impacts people and the lessons we can learn from that engagement. And then we're going to have on the 18th of July a Facebook Live event talking about things. One of the things hopefully we might be able to discuss in that Facebook Live is our new orientation film, which is currently in production, that looks at the history of that site, the retreat, which of course was owned by Judge Parker, taking it from the time of John Brown's raid all the way through the Battle of Cool Spring. So there's a lot of discussion not only of the battle and the personalities involved in the fighting there, but also looking at Judge Parker, his role in Brown's trial, how African Americans reacted to Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry at the retreat. And then we hope to close out July with an online event where students who are working with me this summer researching in the 1890 veteran census are going to share some of their findings. So we're basically uncovering the identities of guys who were born and bred in the Valley and fought for the Union, or guys who came to the Valley after the war who fought for the Union. So we have some things going on. I think our first real sort of live in person where you can see me in 3 dimension will be November the 7th. That's our annual seminar and tour. And it's really going to look at the final months of the conflict in the Valley. So it will look at some various elements of fighting that happened after Cedar Creek, impacts on civilians, again, running the wide gamut, and then ending with a stop at the Freedmen's Bureau site in Winchester.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. Oh gosh, I don't know why I have feedback right now, but thank you guys for joining me, and we will see everyone later. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We're talking about Civil War in a